In the summer of 1941, a British engineer was given a brief that most motorcycle designers would have refused: build a functional motorcycle that fits inside a cylinder 15 inches across, that a resistance fighter can assemble in complete darkness without tools, and that will start reliably after being dropped from an aircraft over occupied France. Not a prototype that never left the workshop. 3,641 were built. SOE Station 9. Test reports documented the assembly time at 11 seconds. That figure is stamped on the official records. Almost nobody today knows the name John Dolphin. To understand why a motorcycle that folded into a cylinder became one of SOE's most operationally successful technical inventions, you have to understand what resistance fighters in occupied France actually needed, and why no existing supply chain could give it to them. In July 1940, Winston Churchill established the Special Operations Executive with an instruction that has become the most famous summary of its purpose: set Europe ablaze. The phrase was theatrical. The organization it produced was not. The SOE was a secret agency charged with supplying, training, and coordinating resistance networks across occupied Europe, a task that existing military channels could not perform because it required operating inside enemy-controlled territory, outside the chain of command, using methods that conventional military culture was not equipped to sanction. Its operational problems were not theatrical in the slightest. They were logistical, mechanical, and lethal in their specificity. One of the most persistent was mobility. A resistance fighter or SOE agent moving through occupied France in 1941 or 1942 had access to a narrow range of transport options. On foot, they could cover perhaps 20 miles in a day without attracting attention. On a bicycle, the most common alternative, they could cover 30 or 40 miles depending on terrain, but a bicycle required a reason to be somewhere, and a person cycling through the wrong district at the wrong hour attracted the kind of interest that ended careers and lives. A motorcycle or car was worse. It required registration documents, a fuel ration book, and a plausible explanation for every journey, all of which had to survive scrutiny from German military police or French milice who were specifically trained to find the inconsistencies in those explanations. What was needed was a vehicle that could appear from nowhere, cover ground quickly, and disappear back into nothing before it needed to be explained. The SOE's answer to problems that conventional military procurement couldn't solve was Station 9. Station 9 was the SOE's primary research and development establishment, housed at the Frythe, a Victorian country house in Welwyn Garden City, Hertfordshire, requisitioned early in the war and converted into a workshop, laboratory, and testing facility whose output was governed entirely by operational requirements rather than the conventional procurement considerations of cost, standardization, or scalability. The principle there was simple. An operational requirement was a design specification. The correct response to an impossible brief was to ask which part was actually impossible. Station 9 produced the Welrod silent pistol, the Wellman miniature submarine, a range of explosive and sabotage devices, and, in 1941, a brief to one of its designers named John Dolphin: build a motorcycle that can be parachute dropped into occupied territory and assembled by the person who finds it. The supply drop container that defined the problem was the Type C, a cylindrical metal canister approximately 15 inches in diameter and 60 inches long, designed to be loaded into the bomb bay of a Halifax or Sterling heavy bomber and dropped on a standard supply mission to a reception committee waiting in a field. It could hold a radio set, weapons, ammunition, medicines, currency, or personal documents. It could hold almost anything, provided that thing was cylindrical and measured no more than 15 inches across. A motorcycle, conventionally built, was not 15 inches across. It was not close to 15 inches across. The handlebars alone on a standard machine of the period spanned approximately 28 inches. The engine, the frame, the fuel tank, all of them presented dimensions that exceeded the container's diameter long before the question of length was even addressed. The Type C container was not a design constraint that could be negotiated. It was the RAF's standard supply drop canister, used across every occupied territory, produced in the quantities needed to sustain the supply networks. If a motorcycle was going to be dropped to resistance fighters in France, it was going to go into that container, or it was not going to go at all. John Dolphin received the brief and a set of container dimensions. He was working at Station 9 by 1941, as part of a team whose default assumption was that a problem the conventional engineering world had not solved was simply one that had not yet been approached from the right direction. He had the brief, he had the container standing beside his drawing board, he had a measurement, just 15 inches across, that excluded every motorcycle he had ever seen. It is a morning in 1941 at the Frythe. The drafting room is in what was once a formal sitting room. High ceilings, tall windows looking out over parkland, long tables with drawing boards. Beside John Dolphin's board, standing upright on the floor, is a Type C container. It is the real object, a sealed metal cylinder, painted matte grey, approximately the height of a man's shoulder. He has a steel rule in his hand. He has already measured the container 4 times. The internal diameter is written at the top of the page in front of him. 15 inches. He looks at the page, he looks at the container. On the page is the beginning of a sketch, the rough silhouette of a motorcycle frame at its most minimal. He has drawn in the engine position, the wheel centers, the seat line. None of it fits inside the circle he has drawn at scale in the margin. He does not reach for a new sheet of paper. He sits with the measurement, the sketch, and the container beside the desk and thinks about which dimension is negotiable. The answer Dolphin eventually determined was that none of the individual dimensions were negotiable, but the relationship between them was. A motorcycle that existed in its operational configuration was wider than 15 inches. A motorcycle in a folded configuration, with specific components collapsed flat against the frame in a defined sequence, could be made to fit within those dimensions. That was the first part. The second was whether it could be made to unfold, reliably, without tools, and with sufficient structural rigidity to carry a person, by someone who had never touched it before finding it in a field at night. The brief was specific on every point. The assembly could not require tools. It could not require any mechanical knowledge, not even the knowledge of how a motorcycle works. It had to be executable in the dark, with cold hands, in terrain that might include mud, uneven ground, or standing crops. Speed mattered absolutely. Not fast in the sense of convenient, fast in the operational sense. The time between a parachute supply drop and a German patrol reaching the area was measured in minutes, not hours, and the machine had to be moving before that window closed. The person using it might never have assembled it before. They might never have ridden a motorcycle. The design had to account for both possibilities. Dolphin did not announce a timeline or request revised specifications. He had the container, the dimensions, and the operational requirement. What he did not yet have was any single idea of how to put a motorcycle inside those dimensions. Only the understanding that it had to be done, that no existing design came close, and that there were people in France waiting for something he had not yet managed to build. The problem Dolphin was solving had 4 distinct components, and each one had to be solved without making any of the others worse. The first was the engine, small enough, reliable enough, simple enough. The second was the frame, rigid in operation, collapsible for storage, and structurally sound under both conditions. The third was the handlebars, which had to collapse below 15 inches and deploy to full width with a single motion. The fourth was the assembly sequence itself, the question of how a person with no mechanical knowledge, no tools, and no light could put all of it together in the seconds between the supply drop and the patrol. The engine had to be small enough to fit inside a 15-inch cylinder, alongside the rest of the machine, powerful enough to carry a person at useful speed, simple enough to start in the cold without priming or adjustment, and reliable enough to survive being dropped from an aircraft inside a metal canister. No existing small motorcycle engine met all 4 requirements simultaneously. The Villiers 98cc 2-stroke came closest. It displaced 98 cubic centimeters, roughly the smallest practical engine size for a vehicle carrying an adult, and produced enough power to move the machine at approximately 30 miles per hour on flat ground. It had no gearbox. This was not an oversight. A gearbox added weight, complexity, and dimensions. The single-speed Villiers could be started with a kick without requiring a specific procedure, and its simplicity meant there was nothing to misadjust in the dark. The loss of gear ratios was an acceptable trade for a machine whose operational requirement was to move a person from a field to a road, not to compete with conventional motorcycles. The frame was the second problem, and in some ways the most fundamental. A conventional motorcycle frame was a rigid welded structure designed to maintain dimensional stability under load. Rigidity was the quality that made it safe. A frame that flexed under cornering or braking was a frame that handled poorly and could fail catastrophically. For the Welbike, that same rigidity had to coexist with the ability to collapse entirely, without tools, in a single motion, into a package that fit within 60 inches of length and 15 inches of width. The 2 requirements were, in conventional engineering terms, contradictory. Dolphin's solution was to locate a single central hinge point in the main frame that allowed the rear section to fold forward against the front section, bringing the rear wheel close to the front wheel and collapsing the overall length to roughly half its operational dimension. The hinge locked rigidly in operation with a single positive engagement latch that required no tools and produced an audible click when fully engaged. Partial engagement was not possible. The latch either engaged completely or it did not engage at all. There was no intermediate position that might be mistaken for secure. The handlebars presented the most visible width problem. The operational width at the handlebars, the distance from grip to grip, was approximately 20 inches, 5 inches wider than the container's diameter. The solution Dolphin developed was an inward folding bar design. Both handlebar sections collapsed inward on a central pivot and locked flat against the top tube of the frame, reducing the overall machine width to within the container diameter. Like the frame latch, the handlebar lock engaged with a single positive motion and could not be left in an intermediate state. The bars were either locked open or locked closed. The footrests folded flat against the lower frame rails. The seat telescoped down against the rear mudguard. The fuel tank, positioned low and centrally on the frame, required no adjustment between stored and operational configurations. The complete assembly sequence, container opened, machine removed, frame unfolded and latched, handlebars raised and locked, seat extended, engine kicked, was designed so that each action made the next action obvious and the previous action confirmed. There was only one correct sequence. The design enforced it. A step performed out of order produced a physical obstruction that identified the error without requiring the operator to diagnose it. It is early December 1942. The grounds behind the Frythe are frost-covered, the grass stiff and pale. A Station 9 test technician, civilian, no motorcycle background, is standing over a Type C container that has just been dropped from a wooden test rig 6 feet above the ground, simulating the deceleration load of a parachute landing. He has a stopwatch. He has been given one instruction: open it and assemble whatever is inside. He opens the container. He tilts the machine out onto the frost. He unfolds the rear section. The latch clicks and raises the handlebars. They click, and pulls the seat upward until it locks. He positions the machine upright on its wheels and places his foot on the kickstarter. The engine catches on the second kick. He looks at the stopwatch. He has not been counting the kicks. He stops the watch at the moment the engine fires. 9 seconds. He writes it in the log. He does not write his reaction. He writes the number. The 9-second result from untrained assembly was consistent across multiple test cycles, varying between 8 and 13 seconds, depending on cold finger conditions and whether the operator had any prior experience of the sequence from a previous run. Dolphin's specification had set 11 seconds as the operational target, a figure derived from SOE field assessments of how quickly a German patrol could respond to a Halifax's engine noise over a French village and reach the probable drop area. The specification was not aspirational. It was a calculation based on observed patrol response times from debriefings of agents who had operated in the field, and it represented the maximum time available between the aircraft's overhead pass and the moment when the reception committee needed to be mobile and dispersed. The cold start reliability required separate testing. A Welbike dropped on a supply mission might sit in its container for days before being used, in temperatures at or below freezing. Station 9 ran cold soak tests, containers placed in refrigerated conditions at temperatures corresponding to winter field storage, and then timed the start sequence. The Villiers 2-stroke started reliably at temperatures down to -10 degrees Celsius without modification to the standard fuel mixture. Below that threshold, a richer mixture was required, which SOE incorporated into the field instructions included with each container. Drop shock testing subjected the containers to impact loads exceeding the actual deceleration of a parachute landing. No structural failures in the assembled machine resulted from these tests, and no latch failures in the fold mechanism were recorded across the test series. The main frame hinge latch proved the most reliable component. It engaged positively under every test condition, including drops where the container had landed on its side or at an angle and required rolling upright before opening. The tests were intended to find the conditions under which the design failed. The test did not find them. By late 1942, the Welbike was already in production. What the test range at the Frythe could not replicate was the darkness and the time pressure, and the sound of a road somewhere nearby that might have traffic on it. The machine worked at Station 9. The question was whether it worked there. Production of the Welbike began in late 1942 at a facility contracted by the Ministry of Supply. The total production run across the war years reached 3,741 machines, a figure modest by the standards of any major wartime manufacturing program, and precisely calibrated to that modesty. The Welbike was not a weapon that would be issued by the tens of thousands, like a rifle or a grenade. It was a specialized logistical tool produced in the quantities the operational requirement specifically called for, enough to supply the principal SOE networks and the airborne and special forces units that had been identified as users. Each machine was built to identical specification, packed into a Type C container with a brief instruction card printed on waterproof paper and a small toolkit for field maintenance rather than assembly, and held in store until a supply mission required it. The containers were indistinguishable from any other Type C drop. The same grey cylinder, the same parachute rigging, the same weight signature on the aircraft's fuel calculation. It is late autumn 1943. A field somewhere between Lyon and Grenoble, well after midnight. 3 people are standing in the dark beside a freshly landed Type C container. They have perhaps 4 minutes before they need to be moving. One of them, a woman in her 20s, opens the container. She has done this once before. In training, in England, in daylight, she tips the folded machine out onto the grass and positions it upright. She unfolds the rear section, the latch clicks, audible even in the dark, and raises the handlebars. They click, and pulls the seat upward until it locks. She positions the machine on level ground. She kicks the starter. The engine fires on the first kick. She does not stop to verify anything. She has already verified everything. She rides toward the road, the two others walking in a different direction, and is gone within 30 seconds of the container hitting the ground. The container is buried in the field before dawn. The Welbike's operational performance in the field matched what Station 9's tests had predicted, and the numbers that define it are best understood against the operational baseline they replaced. Top speed was approximately 30 miles per hour on flat, dry road, modest by any conventional motorcycle standard, and precisely what the brief had required. Fast enough to matter, slow enough to be ridden by an inexperienced user without training. A courier who had previously covered a route on a bicycle in 3 hours could now complete it in under 1. A network that had required a full day to circulate an intelligence report across its operational area could do so in an afternoon. That difference was not tactical in the conventional sense of lines moving on a map. It was the difference between information arriving before a situation changed and information arriving after it already had. And in the resistance circuits of occupied France, that gap was routinely the difference between a successful operation and one that had already been compromised before it started. Range on a full tank was approximately 90 miles. Weight was approximately 70 pounds. Heavy enough to require 2 people to move the container comfortably. Light enough for a single person to maneuver the assembled machine in confined spaces. The absence of a gearbox meant the machine could be ridden by anyone who understood the basic principle of a throttle and a brake, without the additional skill of gear selection. This was not an incidental feature. The resistance fighters and SOE couriers who used Welbikes had not, in most cases, been selected for their motorcycle experience. The machine had been designed for them. The Welbike's concealment advantage was not often discussed in the official documentation, but was understood operationally. A motorcycle that arrived in a sealed canister from a supply drop did not require registration papers, a fuel ration, or a reason to exist. It could be disassembled and returned to its container in the same time it took to assemble, under 4 minutes for a practiced user, and a safe house with a container in the cellar was not obviously harboring a vehicle. This mattered in a theatre where a vehicle without papers was a vehicle that led to questions, and questions led to interrogations, and interrogations ended careers. A supply mission that delivered a Welbike followed the same procedure as every other SOE drop. An aircraft, usually a Halifax or Sterling from the RAF's 138 or 161 Special Duties Squadrons, flew a predetermined route to a drop zone identified by a coded reference and confirmed by the reception committee on the ground, who signaled with torches or bonfires according to an agreed pattern. The aircraft dropped the containers on a single pass at low altitude. The reception committee, rarely more than 4 or 5 people, collected the containers from the field, carried them to a vehicle or a safe house, and dispersed before dawn. The whole process, from the first flash of a signal torch to the last person leaving the field, was designed to take under 30 minutes. A Welbike added one element to that window. A person on a motorcycle could be moving within 11 seconds of opening a container, covering ground in any direction, before the German listening post that tracked unusual aircraft noise had filed a report. Operation Market Garden, the Allied airborne assault on road and rail bridges across the Rhine in September 1944, provides the most documented single operation deployment of the Welbike. The Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron attached to the British 1st Airborne Division dropped with Welbikes as part of the initial exploitation phase of the Arnhem landing. The machines were intended to give the reconnaissance element mobility in the first hours after the drop, when the plan called for a rapid advance to the Arnhem Road Bridge before German forces could consolidate. The operational context at Arnhem deteriorated faster than the planning assumptions had allowed. German armoured forces, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, resting in the area by chance, were closer to the drop zone than any intelligence assessment had indicated. The planned exploitation was curtailed almost immediately. The Welbikes that survived the opening hours of the battle were used for communications and courier work within the shrinking British perimeter for as long as fuel and road conditions permitted. The Special Air Service deployed Welbikes in North Africa and Italy throughout 1943, using them for rapid movement between operational positions and for communication runs between dispersed units in terrain where larger vehicles would have been conspicuous or impractical. The machine's lightweight and compactness made them suitable for the same basic requirement they had been designed for: covering ground quickly in conditions where a conventional vehicle was a liability. The stories of the engineers and designers at Station 9, and of the people who used what they built in French fields and Dutch roads and Libyan desert tracks, are almost entirely absent from the popular history of the resistance. If recovering that kind of record matters to you, subscribing is the only way to make sure the next one reaches you. Because what happened to the Welbike after the war ended was something John Dolphin had not planned for, and it is the part of the story that almost nobody has told. The Special Operations Executive was formally dissolved in January 1946 by order of the Foreign Office. Its records were classified and distributed among the War Office, the Foreign Office, and the files of MI6, where they remained largely inaccessible to public researchers for decades. The names stayed out of the official record. The people who had worked at Station 9 returned to their peacetime careers or moved into other government work without public acknowledgement of what they had built. The Frythe was returned to civilian use and eventually became a research facility for Unilever. The equipment that had been produced at Station 9, the Welrod, the Wellman, the Welbike, and the dozens of other devices that had been developed, tested, and deployed in the preceding 5 years, passed into museum collections, declassified archives, and, in at least one case, the commercial market. It is the summer of 1947. A B road somewhere in the English Midlands, flat and straight, bordered by hedgerows. An Excelsior Motor Company test rider is on what will become the Corgi scooter, the first civilian prototype built around the Welbike's design. The machine looks like something between a toy and a tool. Small wheels, low frame, minimal everything. He is doing 28 miles per hour. The road is empty. There are no checkpoints. There is no curfew. There is no question of where he has come from or where he is going. He opens the throttle slightly, and the machine accelerates to its top speed and holds it. The engine note is the same note, the same 98cc Villiers two-stroke that was in every Welbike dropped into occupied France. He takes a gentle bend and rides on for another half mile. He has been told to assess the handling and the vibration at speed. He notes both. He does not note anything else about the machine, because there is nothing else unusual to note. It is a small motorcycle on a quiet road in England. That is all it is now. The Welbike's design was licensed to the Excelsior Motor Company, a Birmingham-based manufacturer with a long history in small motorcycle production. Excelsior released the civilian version, named the Corgi, in 1948 and produced it until 1954. The Corgi retained the essential architecture of the Welbike: the Villiers 98cc engine, the folding frame, the telescoping seat, and the single-speed drivetrain. The modifications made for civilian sale were pragmatic. A more comfortable seat, an optional luggage carrier at the rear, a slightly revised colour scheme in place of the Welbike's utility grey, and a horn. It was reasonably priced. The launch price of approximately $60 was affordable by the standards of post-war British motoring, where a full-size motorcycle or a small car was beyond most working households. The Corgi was not designed to compete with either. It was designed to fill a gap in the market for short-distance personal transport that was smaller, cheaper, and more economical than anything else available. Britain in 1948 was a country in which most of the population had not yet fully emerged from wartime rationing, and in which the practical value of a cheap, economical personal vehicle was immediately understood without much explanation. Petrol was still rationed until 1950. The roads that the Corgi operated on were the same roads they had always been. Narrow, often poorly maintained, frequently shared with farm vehicles and bicycles. A machine that could cover 10 or 15 miles on a small amount of fuel, that could be stored in a hallway or a garden shed, and that required no license beyond the basic qualification for a motorcycle, found a market that its designers had not anticipated because its designers had not designed it for that market, or for any market at all. The Welbike was not the only Station 9 invention to survive the war in usable form, but it was the only one to make the transition to civilian production. The Welrod pistol, a silent single-shot weapon designed for close-range use by agents, remained in classified military service for decades after 1945 and was reportedly still in limited operational use as late as the Falklands War in 1982. The Wellman submarine, a miniature one-man vessel designed for underwater attack against harbour-bound shipping, was quietly retired. The Welbike became a scooter. The engineering quality of the Welbike is best understood through what it did not try to do. It was not a good motorcycle in any general sense. It was slow, limited in range, unable to carry a passenger, offered no weather protection, and provided a riding experience that most owners of a conventional machine would have found unsatisfying. By every standard metric of motorcycle design, it was inferior, but metric is not the same as purpose. The quality the Welbike possessed was not a general quality, it was a specific one. It fit inside a 15-inch cylinder, it assembled in 11 seconds, and it started reliably in conditions where most machinery failed. Those three attributes were exactly what the brief had specified, and they were the only attributes that mattered to the people who had commissioned it. A tool designed around a single hard constraint, in this case the internal diameter of a parachute supply canister, will be precisely right for the problem that constraint defines, and poorly suited to most problems it does not. The Welbike illustrated both outcomes simultaneously. It was an engineering solution so exact that it had almost no application outside the problem it had been built for, yet mechanically sound enough when that problem disappeared to find a second use in a completely different context. The Corgi scooter, sold throughout its production run, found its primary market among suburban and urban commuters looking for economical short-distance transport, and was discontinued in 1954 when the market it had been serving was absorbed by machines that were more capable and designed for a wider range of uses. This was not a failure. It was a vehicle that served the purpose its commercial context defined. For as long as that context held, the machine that had been designed for occupied France had become a mild-mannered utility vehicle for peacetime England. The engineering was unchanged, the frame still folded, the Villiers engine still caught on the first kick at temperatures well below freezing, the latch still produced its audible click when fully engaged. Only the reason for using it had become completely unrecognizable. There is a drawing in the files at the Frythe, dated 1941, annotated in pencil in the margins by John Dolphin. It shows a motorcycle folded into a cylinder, 15 inches in diameter and 60 inches long. The notes specify weight, fold sequence, and assembly time. The problem he was solving was precise. How to give a person moving through occupied France the speed of a motorcycle and the concealment of a piece of luggage. The Welbike never decided a battle. No single raid turned on whether someone could ride 30 miles faster than they could walk. What it did was move people through landscapes where moving quickly and quietly was sometimes the difference between completing a mission and not returning. John Dolphin designed it in a country house in Hertfordshire. It was assembled in darkness, in French fields, by people whose names most histories do not record. They had 11 seconds. Then they rode.